He's dismantled politicians with a raised eyebrow, eviscerated media figures with a well-timed pause, and exposed hypocrisy with nothing more than common sense, delivered in that signature deadpan. When Prince Harry walked into his studio with a list of grievances and fire in his eyes, determined to finally confront the man who'd mocked his media strategy on national television for years, he made the same mistake everyone makes with Jon Stewart. He thought he could win an argument against someone who argues for a living. He thought his righteous indignation would overwhelm the comedian's wit. He thought being a prince gave him an edge against a man who spent his entire career puncturing exactly that kind of self-importance. Within 20 minutes, he would discover what every politician, pundit, and power broker who'd faced Jon Stewart had learned. You don't come for the king of common sense unless you're prepared to have your contradictions exposed, your talking points dismantled, and your exit filmed for posterity. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you hit subscribe and smash that like button. Now, let's get into what really happened in that studio. The Daily Show studio was unusually quiet. No audience tonight, just two chairs positioned across from each other, minimal crew, cameras capturing every angle. This was a special segment, a one-on-one conversation that had been negotiated for weeks after Harry's team made clear he wanted to address Jon's previous commentary directly. Jon had agreed, somewhat amused by the demand. He'd said things about Harry, observations about his media strategy, jokes about the victimhood industrial complex, commentary on the gap between his privacy claims and his publicity appetite. Nothing cruel, just honest. The kind of observations that anyone paying attention had already made. The door opened, and Prince Harry entered. But there was nothing casual about his expression. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp, his posture carrying the tension of someone who'd come to settle scores, rather than have a conversation. He crossed the studio floor with deliberate strides and settled into his chair without offering a greeting. "Harry, thanks for doing this." "Jon." The single word carried the temperature of a glacier. Jon smiled. He loved a hostile guest. They were always more interesting. "So, I understand you have some issues with things I've said about you." Harry's eyes narrowed. "I have issues with a lot of things you've said. About me, about my wife, about what we're trying to accomplish." "Great! Let's get into it. That's what we're here for." "Are we?" "Because I was told this would be a conversation. Your previous comments suggest you're more interested in cheap shots than actual dialogue." Jon nodded thoughtfully. "I make observations. It's kind of my thing. I've made observations about everyone. Presidents, prime ministers, billionaires. You're in distinguished company. I'm not looking for your company. I'm looking for accountability." "Accountability for what? Making observations about publicly available information?" "That's what I do, Harry. I watch people say things and then I comment on whether those things make sense. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes that's funny." Harry leaned forward, his voice sharpening. "You called me a case study in having your cake and eating it too. You said I escaped the spotlight by standing in a brighter one. You implied my struggles weren't genuine." Jon shrugged. "I implied your struggles and your media strategy are sometimes in tension. That's not the same as saying your struggles aren't real. Both things can be true simultaneously. That's a very convenient distinction." "It's an accurate distinction. You can genuinely suffer and also leverage that suffering for commercial purposes. Many people do. I'm not judging the choice, I'm naming it. Naming it sounds a lot like judging it. Only if you think being named is the same as being criticized. I described what I observed. If the description feels critical, maybe examine why." Harry's face flushed with frustration, but he kept his composure. "You've spent years mocking me on this show." "Not years. A few segments. Maybe 30 minutes total over several years. You're not that central to our content, Harry. No offense." The dismissal clearly stung. Harry had come expecting to be the focus of sustained mockery. Learning he was merely an occasional target seemed worse somehow. Those segments reached millions of people, as did your Netflix documentary, and your Oprah interview, and your book, and all the other media you've done. I'm not sure my 30 minutes outweighs your 100 hours. That's different. I was telling my own story. And I was commenting on it. That's how public discourse works. You tell your story, I offer perspective, the audience decides what they think. That's not unfair, that's democracy. It's unfair when the perspective is biased against me. Jon tilted his head. What bias? I don't know you. I have no personal stake in whether you succeed or fail. I watched what you put out publicly and commented on the contradictions I noticed. That's not bias, that's attention, selective attention. You focused on things that made me look bad. I focused on things that were interesting. Contradictions are interesting. When someone says they want privacy and then does a 6-part Netflix documentary, that's interesting. When someone complains about tabloid coverage and then gives tabloids constant content through public appearances, that's interesting. I didn't create those contradictions. You did. I just pointed at them. Harry's voice rose slightly. Context matters. There's a reason for everything I've done. I'm sure there is. But reasons don't erase contradictions. They explain them. You can have excellent reasons for contradictory behavior. That doesn't make the behavior less contradictory. Harry shifted tactics, his expression hardening. Let's talk about specific things you've said. You called my media strategy a masterclass in strategic victimhood. You said I monetized my trauma while complaining about exploitation. You suggested that... Jon held up a hand. I know what I've said. I've said a lot of things. Here's the thing about my show. I comment on power. Celebrities, politicians, institutions. You are now a person of significant power. You have platforms that reach millions. You have wealth most people can't imagine. You have influence over public discourse. When you have that much power, you get commented on. That's the deal. I don't have power. I have platforms that I've built despite constant opposition. Those platforms are power, Harry. A $100 million Netflix deal is power. A best-selling memoir is power. The ability to shape narratives that millions of people believe is power. You're not the underdog you present yourself as. I'm an underdog compared to the institution I left. You're an underdog compared to the British monarchy. Congratulations. So is everyone else. Compared to normal people, the audience watching this, you're extraordinarily privileged and powerful. The question is whether you can acknowledge that while also acknowledging your struggles. I've acknowledged plenty. You've acknowledged struggle. You haven't acknowledged privilege, not really. Every time someone mentions your advantages, you redirect to your disadvantages. That's not balance. That's deflection. Harry's eyes flashed. I didn't have advantages. I worked for everything I have. You were born a prince. That's literally an advantage. You had access to education, connections, and opportunities that most people can only dream of. Yes, you've worked. Yes, you've struggled. But you've done both from a starting point that most humans never reach in their entire lives. You're trying to minimize my experience. I'm trying to contextualize your complaints. There's a difference. The tension in the room was palpable now. Jon remained calm. He always remained calm. But there was a sharpness in his observations that cut through Harry's defenses. Let's change the subject, Harry said abruptly. Sure. How's Meghan? The shift in Harry's demeanor was immediate. Walls going up, expression closing off. I'd prefer not to discuss my wife. Jon's eyebrows rose. But she's central to your entire narrative. Your love story, your departure from royal life, your new chapter in America. It's all joint. How can we discuss your life without discussing her? We can focus on my individual experience, which is what? Your foundation is joint. Your media appearances are joint. Your brand is Sussex, not just Harry. What exactly is your individual experience separate from her? Harry paused, seemingly unable to answer. Jon continued gently. I'm not trying to trap you. I'm genuinely asking. You've positioned yourself as part of a team. When you remove the team from the conversation, what's left? I have my own identity. I'm sure you do. But you haven't shown it to the public. Everything we know about your post-royal life involves Meghan. So when you say you don't want to discuss her, you're essentially saying you don't want to discuss your entire public existence. Harry's voice sharpened dangerously. There are rumors I'd like to address, since you're bringing her up. Which rumors? The separation rumors, the divorce speculation. They're completely false. Completely. We're stronger than ever. Jon nodded slowly. Okay, good. Though I notice you brought up divorce, I just asked how she was doing. Why did your mind go there? Harry stiffened. Because that's what the tabloids are saying. I'm not the tabloids. I asked a simple question. You escalated to divorce denials. That's interesting. It's not interesting. It's defensive. Because I'm tired of people asking about your marriage? Because you've invited those questions. The Netflix documentary, the interviews, the book, all of it centers on your relationship. You can't make your marriage the core of your brand and then complain when people ask about it. We're not a brand. You literally trademarked your names. You have a production company. You license your image. How is that not a brand? Harry slammed his hand on the arm of his chair. I'm not going to sit here and have my marriage questioned by a comedian. Jon's expression didn't change. I didn't question your marriage. I asked how your wife is doing. You're the one who introduced divorce into the conversation. If anyone's questioning your marriage, it's you. The observation landed with devastating precision. Harry's face went from red to pale. Harry stood up slightly, then sat back down, a false start that betrayed his agitation. You're deliberately provoking me. I'm asking you questions. If basic questions feel like provocation, maybe examine why. Because your questions are loaded. My questions are simple. How's it going? How's California? How's your wife? Those are literally the softest questions I could ask. If they feel loaded, the explosives are coming from somewhere else. You're twisting everything I say. I'm repeating everything you say. There's a difference. Your words are your words. I'm just pointing at them. Harry exhaled sharply. Let's talk about something else. Sure. Let's talk about the Netflix situation. Some of your projects got canceled recently. What happened there? Harry's expression flickered. The first sign of genuine discomfort beyond anger. Projects evolve. That's the nature of the entertainment industry. Evolve is a generous word for canceled. The trades used more direct language. They suggested Netflix wasn't getting value for their investment. The trades sensationalize everything. They also report facts. And the fact seems to be that a $100 million deal has produced less than expected. People are curious what went wrong. Nothing went wrong. Our focus shifted to other priorities. What priorities? Genuine question. You left Royal Life saying you wanted to build something meaningful. You signed a massive deal. The deal seems to be underperforming. What's the explanation? We don't produce content on demand like circus animals. We speak when we have something important to say. Jon leaned back. But Netflix didn't pay you to wait until inspiration struck. They paid for content. Content hasn't materialized. I'm trying to understand the gap between promise and delivery. Harry's face reddened. You're doing what everyone does, reducing complex creative work to business metrics. I'm doing what any reasonable person does when someone takes a lot of money and produces not much, asking what happened. That's not reduction. That's accountability. The room fell silent for a moment. Jon watched Harry with an expression that wasn't hostile, more curious, maybe even sympathetic. But his observations kept landing with devastating precision. You know what I find interesting? He said, breaking the silence. You came here to confront me. You wanted to put me in my place, but you haven't actually disputed anything I've said. You've said my comments were unfair. You've said I don't understand, but you haven't pointed to a single thing I've said that was factually wrong. Harry's face reddened further. Your framing is wrong. My framing is observation. I've watched what you've done and described it. If the description is unflattering, maybe the actions are the problem, not the description. You're twisting everything. I'm repeating your own words and actions back to you. If that feels like twisting, maybe examine the original shape. That's incredibly condescending. It's incredibly honest. Those feel the same when you're not used to pushback. Harry stood up fully now, his composure finally cracking. This was a mistake. Coming here was a mistake. Jon didn't stand. He just looked up at Harry with that infuriating calm. Probably, but not for the reasons you think. What's that supposed to mean? You came here thinking you'd put me in my place. You thought righteous indignation would overwhelm my observations, but indignation is an argument. Being upset about what someone said isn't the same as proving them wrong. And you haven't proven me wrong about anything. You've just expressed displeasure. Loudly, repeatedly, and with increasing hostility. Because you won't engage fairly. I've done nothing but engage. You're the one who keeps trying to end the conversation. Every time I make an observation you can't counter, you deflect, accuse me of bias, or invoke privacy. Those are exit strategies, not engagement. Harry grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, his movements sharp with controlled fury. I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by a comedian who's made a career out of being smug. I've made a career out of being honest. Sometimes honesty looks like smugness to people who aren't used to it. There's nothing honest about what you do. You pick targets and mock them for entertainment. I pick contradictions and highlight them for clarity. Sometimes that's entertaining. But entertainment isn't the goal. Understanding is. And I understand you pretty well, Harry. Better than you seem to understand yourself. You don't know anything about me. I know what you've shown me. And what you've shown me, both tonight and over the past few years, is someone who wants to be seen as a victim and a victor simultaneously. Who wants sympathy for his struggles and admiration for his success. Who wants privacy when it's convenient and publicity when it serves him. Those contradictions aren't character flaws, they're human. But the refusal to acknowledge them is where it gets problematic. Harry's voice rose to something close to a shout. I acknowledge plenty. You acknowledge what serves your narrative. When criticism is unfair, you call it out. When criticism is legitimate, you call it unfair. That's not acknowledgement. That's deflection. How dare you? I dare because it's true. I've watched it happen. Valid questions about your statements get labeled as attacks. Reasonable skepticism gets called bias. It's effective. People are afraid to challenge you because they don't want to be accused of whatever ism applies. But it's also transparent to anyone paying attention. Harry stood frozen at the edge of the set, caught between his desire to leave and his inability to let Jon have the last word. You're going to regret this. Jon smiled slightly. I've been hearing that for 30 years. Still waiting for the regret to kick in. I mean it. People will see how I was treated here. They'll see exactly what happened. A comedian asking questions. A prince refusing to answer them. A confrontation that the guest created and then fled from. I'm not fleeing. You're literally walking toward the door because you can't handle basic questions about your own public statements. What would you call that? Harry stared at Jon for a long moment. Something flickered behind his eyes. Anger, certainly, but also something that might have been recognition. The uncomfortable awareness that maybe, just some of what Jon was saying had truth in it. But he couldn't admit that. Not here. Not now. This interview is over. It was over before it started. You came here to win an argument, not to have a conversation. When winning proved impossible, you decided to leave. That's a pattern, Harry. It's not a pattern. It's absolutely a pattern. You leave situations you can't control. The palace, the UK, any interview that doesn't go your way. Running away is your signature move. Harry pointed at Jon, his hand trembling. I don't run away. You're literally walking toward the exit right now. What would you call that? The observation stopped Harry in his tracks. He stood frozen, caught between his desire to leave and his awareness that leaving would prove Jon's point. I'm choosing not to participate in this ambush. What ambush? I asked you how you're doing. I asked about your life in America. I asked about your wife. I asked about your projects. Those are literally the most basic interview questions. If they feel like an ambush, you've been doing the wrong interviews. Harry's voice dropped to something cold. You'll never understand what I've been through. Jon nodded slowly. You're right. I won't. Because you won't let anyone understand. You share everything and explain nothing. You perform trauma without processing it. You demand empathy while offering none. Understanding requires exchange, Harry. And you only want one-way traffic. Harry turned toward the door, then stopped, looking back for one final confrontation. History will vindicate me. Jon smiled sadly. Maybe. Or history will see someone who had extraordinary opportunities and spent most of his time complaining about them. Someone who could have used his platform for almost anything and chose to use it primarily for grievance. Someone who had everything and still felt wronged. He paused. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you find peace. But peace isn't something you find by arguing with everyone who sees you clearly. At some point, you have to stop and wonder if maybe, just maybe, the people noticing contradictions aren't the problem. Harry opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to realize he had nothing left to say. He turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a decisive click. Jon sat alone in the studio for a moment, then turned to face the camera. Well, that happened? He rubbed his temples. I want to be clear about something. I didn't set out to have a confrontation. He wanted to confront me about my previous commentary, and I explained that commentary. He didn't like my explanations. That's fine. He doesn't have to like them. But not liking something isn't the same as refuting it. He leaned back in his chair. Here's what I notice about conversations like this. They never actually engage with the substance. He was upset that I'd called him strategic. But he didn't argue that he wasn't strategic. He just didn't like the label. He was upset that I'd noted contradictions between his privacy claims and his publicity actions. But he didn't explain how those things weren't contradictory. He just resented me noticing. Jon shrugged. That's not conversation. That's complaint. And I've been doing this too long to pretend complaint is the same as dialogue. I'll continue commenting on public figures who seem contradictory. That's my job. If they want to come on and explain themselves, I'm happy to listen. But if they just want to express displeasure that I noticed something, that's not really productive for anyone. He looked directly into the camera. We'll be back next week with actual dialogue. Hopefully. The interview lasted 22 minutes before Harry walked out. Its impact would last considerably longer. Jon Stewart continued doing what he'd always done, asking the questions nobody else would ask, noticing the contradictions nobody else would mention, and refusing to apologize for clarity. Prince Harry returned to Montecito, to his foundation work, to his ongoing media strategy. But the confrontation followed him, proof that his narrative couldn't withstand someone who simply refused to accept it without examination. Some battles you win by fighting harder. Others you lose by picking the wrong opponent. Jon Stewart had been dismantling powerful people's contradictions for 3 decades. He wasn't about to stop for a prince. What do you think? Was Jon too harsh? Or did Harry deserve every observation? Who would you want to see on The Daily Show next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video to help it